despite what is currently being said, I don't know that the United States is, in fact, walking away from supporting Ukraine. That with President Trump, nothing is ever final. Everything is negotiable. And when it becomes of interest to him and to the United States, there will be adjustments made. And so I would say, hold your breath.
The US has said it'll now take a step back from mediating peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State and temporary national security advisor, insisted the United States was not abandoning peace efforts and that it would be ready to help if we can. Well, earlier, Times Radio Drive spoke to the US State Department's spokesperson, Tom Pigott, about the apparent change in US policy.
Well, I think walk away in terms of how we're defining that, I think is very important. What we're going to see, again, is not flying to have meetings for the sake of meetings, but if there's ever a time, and as Secretary Rubio said yesterday, where we're seeing that movement, there's that serious movement towards peace, where we're having that benefit of having people come together, the United States stands ready to achieve peace. The United States and President Trump have made clear they want to see this conflict come to an end, and that remains the same. We just saw this critical minerals deal with Ukraine that was tremendously important in terms of the long-term economic partnership, the long-term economic mutual interest that we're seeing. So if there's a movement towards peace, we want to see that movement over the next few days.
That's the State Department's Tim Pigott speaking to Times Radio Drive earlier today. Well, Suriya Jayanti is a former US diplomat to Ukraine during Donald Trump's first term. She's on the line. Suriya, hello, welcome to the programme.
Good evening, and thank you for having me.
Excellent. Now, I understand you're the only US chief executive of a Ukrainian company working in the Ukrainian nuclear sector. Given that, how do you feel about the United States and all its diplomatic muscle saying, well, we're throwing in the towel, effectively?
I think it's worth remembering that, of course, the United States isn't throwing in the towel. So as you mentioned, the United States just signed a major deal, which should end up with treaty status once it is approved by the Ukrainian parliament, that will help build economic cooperation between the United States and Ukraine and should result in a considerable amount of investment, hopefully bilateral as well, but certainly money that Ukraine needs for its reconstruction. I think rather, it's best to view the announcement by the United States that it is not going to prioritize the diplomatic path to finding a solution as a statement of frustration with both the Kremlin and with Bankova, with Kyiv. I think Trump did probably mean it, or at least mean it aspirationally, and mean it as a statement of his own power that he was going to achieve peace in Ukraine within 24 hours of becoming president. And so I think frustration is really what we're seeing. And on the heels of the success of the minerals deal being signed, it is a not bad moment for the State Department and the White House to say they are going to take a different tack without it looking like a failure.
Well, the fact is that it will look like look like a failure to many people observing this, particularly given the vainglorious nature of the statement. I can solve this in 24 hours and this wouldn't have happened if I were president. And then to both sides the situation, saying, well, I'm frustrated with both Russia and Ukraine. Given that everybody knows that Russia invaded Ukraine first in 2014 and again in 2022. It doesn't look good.
I think it is absolutely more than unfortunate that there has been any suggestion anywhere that Ukraine is responsible for the war. Ukraine was invaded. It was invaded without any form of provocation. It is something that Putin and the Kremlin had planned for a long time. It has been greatly destabilizing for Europe and, of course, a tragedy for and in Ukraine. It has, however, meant that to achieve peace, you need both Ukraine and Russia to agree. And so I think if one looks at just the diplomatic realism, the realpolitik of the situation, Russia occupies about a quarter of Ukraine, give or take a couple of percentage at this point. And it has managed to expand the territory that it occupies from what it had held not since 2014, but what it had gained between 2014 and the full-scale invasion in 22. And however much one wishes that this could be a complete unilateral withdrawal, the fact of the matter is that it has to be decided by all parties. if you consider that what President Trump is probably most focused on, which is achieving a success, then who started it becomes, at least from his perspective, almost irrelevant.
Well,
I'm not
but
endorsing
isn't that isn't that the naivety, Suriya? Because if you both sides it and you give Russia lots of carrots and then beat Ukraine with sticks, then of course Russia will keep on pushing, thinking it doesn't really matter what we do; he'll always be on our side. Isn't that where the biggest mistake was made?
Well, it's pretty clear it's not working. So I'm with you on it not being a winning strategy. And it's also true that, as Ukraine has said, and as every country surrounding Russia that is trying to maintain its own independence has said, you cannot appease Putin. And it was a strategy of appeasement that probably in some way laid the path to the full-scale invasion in 22, by which I mean there was some indication that the then White House, the Biden administration, was taking an appeasement approach. If you look at the green lighting of the Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline, for example, it was generally considered to be an effort to neither make Germany less friendly nor to avoid to give the Kremlin a carrot, and it backfired spectacularly. So it is certainly, I think, an absolute at this point, and pretty much everyone agrees that if you try to appease Putin, you simply lay the groundwork for a subsequent, some years down the line, resurgence and another wave of aggression. And that has certainly been Ukraine's experience at this point for hundreds of years. And I think recent history proves it true.
Yeah, you know Ukraine well, Suriya. When you look at Tammy Bruce's statement, she speaks for the US State Department. She said it's now up to Kiev and Moscow to come up with what she calls concrete proposals for ending the conflict. Well, the USA has huge convening power, huge muscle, both military and diplomatic. If they walk away or step back, who on earth fills the breach? I mean, these are two countries at war.
Ukraine is probably in trouble if the United States actually cuts off both budgetary but also military support. The United States has given billions, somewhere around 120, but it depends a little bit on how you count, because not all announcements of aid are actual aid, some are pledges, and because a lot of the aid has actually gone straight into U.S. pockets. 70% of the aid given has been spent in the United States and paid to U.S. companies. So regardless of exactly how much you calculate it, it's been a considerable amount of money, and it has been extremely important for Ukraine's defense. The United States is not, however, the biggest donor. That if you look at the European Union, in fact, the European Union has been hugely supportive of Ukraine. And so there are alternatives to the United States, but they will require political will that has thus far been somewhat evasive. That said, a stronger Russia and a weaker Ukraine is something that most of Europe is scared of. And so what we may well now see, and what I hope to see, is that Europe will pull itself together as an entity and cover the gap of U.S. pullback.
Yeah, I know
Also
this week
noting,
that the...
however,
Sorry, Suriya, I just wanted to get this in. I know this week that the president signed off on $50 million worth of military support for Ukraine. That's the first since he was sworn in. I'm just wondering what the chances are that this is a turning point. And following his meeting with Zelensky in Rome, in the Vatican, Starmer and Macron, and the frustration with Putin and Moscow, he might be thinking, okay, I'm going to walk away. And contrary to expectations, I'm actually going to give the Ukrainians a little bit more military muscle. He might do that.
He may well, and that was my second point, which is, despite what is currently being said, I don't know that the United States is, in fact, walking away from supporting Ukraine. That with President Trump, nothing is ever final. Everything is negotiable. And when it becomes of interest to him and to the United States, there will be adjustments made. And so I would say, hold your breath on this, because I suspect this is the first of a number of U.S. support, perhaps less than before, but I'd be very surprised if it were actually going to dry up.
Okay, Suriya Jayanti, former U.S. diplomat to Ukraine and the only U.S. CEO of a Ukrainian company working in the Ukrainian nuclear sector. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio.